Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, here with writer and documentarian Astra Taylor, Occupy Wall Street activist Amin Hussein, Sarah Ludwig of the Neighborhood Economic Development Project, and Doug Henwood of The Nation magazine. We're talking about debt, the role debt plays in people's lives, and also Strike Debt, the initiative from an Occupy Wall Street offshoot, if that's a fair term, to essentially purchase distressed debt and then forgive it. And Sarah, there's something you want to say. I mean, you're working with communities whose lives are structured by debt and hounded by collection agencies.
Yeah, and I think we have to understand this debt buying and debt collection in the context of a financial system that is really predicated on inequality and exploitation. So the way we understand the debt buying industry is that it's one more stop on the spectrum of exploitative practices. So we know that credit's exploded, but what kinds of credit? I mean, we've seen the banks have just made an absolute killing. We think about Chase and Bank of America that have really targeted struggling people for very high cost credit. Yeah. They charge very high interest rates, jack in fees. I mean, that's the business model. And they know full well that in their high volume of credit that they're issuing, that there's going to be a percentage of people that aren't going to be able to pay the debt. And so, lots of people are struggling to pay, so they make tons of money on that. And then they get to write off the debt that they don't collect after a certain number of days. They get a tax benefit from that. And then they also have spun off this whole debt buying industry.
But can I play devil's advocate on this, right? I mean, so people who support the system, right, will broadly say, there was long periods of time in which certain communities had no access to credit, and it was economically it was an economic stranglehold, right? I mean, if you don't have any access to credit and you can't take loans to start a small business or buy a house, that's massively problematic, and it was something that progressives fought against, right? And you have the Community Reinvestment Act and redlining practices, et cetera. And second of all, look, if you're going to lend to someone, and you're going to say, well, we're going to make credit available, and you lend to someone and you make $20,000 a year, you're a high risk to not repay the loan, and so the market prices your interest higher, and I charge you a higher rate on it. What's wrong with that?
Well, you don't say people don't have access to credit, so let's fill that need by exploiting people and charging, usurious rates and having payday loans at 400% APR, which is really, in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods, that is our financial system. We have a separate and unequal financial system, and so in this debt that gets sold, a huge percentage of it is medical debt and credit card debt. And so you've got people who are actually don't even know that, the way this is sold, it's so shoddy and flimsy. The banks, what they sell are just spreadsheets. They don't even have solid information. So there's absolute due process violations and so forth in the pursuit of this debt. Because increasingly what they're doing is actually using the courts to go after people, overwhelmingly low-income people and people of color.
Our focus on debt has to be considered in a continuum of analysis that we've done since September 17 of last year and what we've done in Occupy Wall Street. When you look at the 99% tumbler, you see what's aching people, but it's missing the structural analysis. To us, debt, the focus on debt is both personal and structural, and it opens up space for imagining new ways, a set of social relations. It's not about whether debt is bad or good. That's actually a red herring. The thing about it is where is the socially useful good debt, and how do we produce that?
What is interesting, I think, about the telethon, right, is that in some ways it's this, and there's a conservative on Forbes who wrote this sort of trolling piece about you guys being like, finally something a conservative can get behind, right? Like
Burkean.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's Burkean. It's not making any claims on the state. It's just some people helping people, and Catholic charities, basically, more or less, but with hipper music or whatever. And there's something actually both kind of amazing about that, right? That he's reclaiming this tradition of mutual aid, which is a very long tradition in left organizing, but also just in American civic life. But also, there's something. Are you guys just running basically a charity here, and people give money, donate it, and then you forgive the debt, and people will say, well, the people whose debt is being sold 5 cents on the dollar, collectors have basically given up on it anyway, and can you even find the people whose debt you're forgiving?
I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about this project is that it actually has concrete effects. It will the money raised will go to abolishing people's medical debt, and often the credit card bills that they have to incur because they can't pay their medical bills, right? So there will be this very concrete effect on people as a consequence. But I think an equally important part of this project is the public education campaign, and that's where it is more radical because our analysis is deeper. And I agree with Doug, debt is a symptom, and our job is to get people to take that step. one of our phrases is "You are not alone." Right? The situation you're in is not just you as an individual having made a mistake.
L-O-A-N.
Yeah, just so that pun reads on television. You are not a space L-O-A-N.
Yeah. Right. That this is not this is political and personal. And if you are the driver who came and picked me up today to bring me to the show told me he had he had to get his appendix out, and he ended up with $40,000 of medical debt. So we're saying, okay, this debt exists because we don't have a system in place where there's health care, because health care is a commodity, and your debt is illegitimate, and we want to do that public education. So the project is twofold.
Right. A year ago, we started saying, the banks got bailed out, people got sold out. Right. This is our answer, but it's just the beginning to highlight that no one should go into debt for basic needs. And if you look at the analysis from the 1930s, they were pushing debt on us, right? And these bubbles were created and what have you. And from the 1930s up until this point, we have gone from having social welfare type stuff for people that are in need to a debt-fair state where our most basic necessities of existence, we have to go into debt to get them.
The American dream is getting out of debt now. You talk to young people,
true.
right?
That's
You talk to young people
That's
and they're just
key
like...
aspiration.
This is also something, if we're talking about organizing for the next generation, young people are so weighted down by student debt and other types of debt. And so I just want to say that part of our project before the Rolling Jubilee was this Debt Resisters Operations Manual that lays out our bigger analysis. And, I think you have to understand all of our projects in tandem.
Doug, is debt forgiveness is something that sounds, either sort of spiritually inflected or hippy-dippy or impractical. But there's been a strong economic case that actually the technical term for this, particularly in the case of the mortgage market, which is principal write-downs, right? Which is basically saying, look, the lender is just going to write off some portion of the principal on the loan, right? Not recalibrate the interest rate, but actually just take a haircut on that chunk of the loan. That would actually be good economic policy. It would make good sense.
The IMF even agrees with this.
The IMF even agrees with this, but we have not seen...
The IMF now is pressing the Europeans not to be so hard on Greece and Spain. And the Germans don't want to hear this, but the IMF actually supports this.
But would it be possible to have some policy version of this that would be some kind of broad definition?
Absolutely. We'd look at the example of Iceland, which is a very tiny place, a few 100,000 people. But one of the ways they got out of their economic crisis was that the government went through all the loans. They went through all the business and personal loans and decided, well, we'll write this down by 10%, we'll write that down by 20%. It was a very orderly process. They stiffed their foreign creditors, too, which is a nice thing to do because we might not have the luxury to do that here. But on the other hand, that kind of going through the debts and writing things down, it's orthodox capitalist practice. And corporate restructurings, they do it all the time. And we didn't do that here. And part of the problem, there is a political issue where people who are paying their debts resent it when people who they see as irresponsible get a break. So we do have that, this is a very, solidarity is sometimes lacking in this country.
Well, and also we should all remember, right, the launching moment for the Tea Party, right? People say, it was anger at the banks. No, it was on CNBC,
Santelli.
Right, Rick Santelli was yelling about the losers getting bailed out, right? It was actually a very sort of small, marginal reformist initiative announced by the Obama administration that was going to sort of help people a little bit with their interest payments, and Rick Santelli went crazy about it, and it was precisely this sort of thing.
They call that moral hazard, and one has to ask, where's the true moral hazard in our financial system? And, it's really interesting because with these debt buyers, what they do is they use the courts, as I was saying before, to go after people, and there are hundreds of thousands of lawsuits filed in New York City alone each year to go after people in debt collection. And the thing that's interesting is they get judgments through fraudulent means, and they go on people's credit reports. So you start to spin out the focus on debt collection, and you see, well, if these judgments are going on people's credit reports and they might be ill-gotten, then that impedes people's access to jobs, people's access to housing.
Renting an apartment, ask for credit reports. One of the things I want to say here is you hear a lot from conservatives about freedom, and freedom is a word that's been very appropriated by one side of the political spectrum. But I think one of the things that's profound about this is that, being in deep debt and having a bad credit report and having a hang over you is a shackling thing. It does limit freedom, and if we want to maximize freedom, that's something we have to go out head on. If people want to contribute, they can go to rollingjubilee.org. From the Rolling Jubilee, I want to thank Astra Taylor and Amin Hussein, as well as Sarah Ludwig from the Neighborhood Economic Development Project, and my colleague Doug Hedwood from The Nation magazine. All right, will the president tackle climate change in his second term? That's next. For the first time in what seems like a long while, the reality of climate change is back on the political agenda. Like many of you, I spent this election season increasingly depressed about the climate's near total absence from the conversation. Then 19 days ago, the arrival of Sandy and the death and destruction it left in its wake made silence on the issue impossible to maintain. Since then, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has talked about climate change, and so has President Obama, both when he was asked about it at his news conference and on his own initiative in his victory speech.
We want our children to live in America that isn't burdened by debt, that isn't weakened by inequality, that isn't threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet.
What specifically do you plan to do in a second term to tackle the issue of climate change? And do you think the political will exists in Washington to pass legislation that could include some kind of a tax on carbon?
I am a firm believer that climate change is real, that it is impacted by human behavior and carbon emissions. And as a consequence, I think we've got an obligation to future generations to do something about it.
We must rethink and redesign for the long term, because extreme weather, as we have learned, is the new normal.
And if this week's settlement with BP for the Deepwater Horizon disaster wasn't reminder enough of the environmental hazards of pursuing fossil fuels, there are new pictures today of the Black Elk oil rig just 20 miles off the coast of Louisiana, where an explosion and fire yesterday injured at least 9 people, with the Coast Guard yesterday saying 2 more are missing. But even as the conversation has shifted, the stakes made more dramatically apparent, and polling shows Americans increasingly focused on climate peril. The basic political physics are almost as clear as the planetary physics. Making, as the president said, a, quote, serious dent in climate change requires taking action that will cost huge, almost incomprehensible amounts of money to the wealthiest and arguably most powerful corporate interests in the history of the world. The main challenge climate hawks face, then, isn't absence of policy, but building sufficient political power to make those policies a possibility. Joining me now is Bill McKibben, author of Earth, Making Life on a Tough New Planet, and founder of 350.org, which has launched a Do the Math tour focusing on the hard numbers behind climate change and advocates a new strategy to create political leverage for a solution. Alana Shore, Capitol Hill reporter for the environmental news website Greenwire and a Knight Science Journalism fellow at MIT. And back at the table are Democratic New York Congressman Jerry Nadler and MSNBC contributor Joy Reid. Well, Bill McKibben, I slightly facetiously greeted you as a rock star because you're selling out these big venues across the country. I've been seeing people tweeting about it. People watching right now that are not familiar with the math that you are talking about, what is the math? What are you trying to communicate on this tour?
You know, this came out of this piece I wrote for Rolling Stone this summer that went strangely viral, became one of their most shared pieces. And it's because it laid out, finally, the rock and the hard place.
Right.
We've got, if we're going to keep the temperature from going up past 2 degrees, which is what everybody in the world, including the U.S. government, has said is too high. That's the red line.
Right. We want to keep it below 2 degrees. Even 2 degrees is going to cause a lot of dislocation and problems.
We're already at 1 degree, and that melted the Arctic. So
right.
If we were smart, we'd stop way short of
right.
2. But that's the best at this point that anyone government will commit to. If we're going to do that, the scientists tell us we can burn about 550 gigatons more carbon, 550 billion tons more carbon, which sounds like a hell of a lot. But we're burning 30-some billion tons a year. We'll get about 15 years at current rates before we shoot past that threshold. And that's the good news. The bad news, the third number, the really scary one, is that last year a group of financial analysts added up how much carbon the fossil fuel industry had in its reserves. That number is about 2,800 gigatons, or 5 times as much. And they're going to burn it. I mean, unless we figure out how to stop them, that's what Exxon's share price is based on. When Peabody Coal borrows money, that's their collateral. There's no longer any room for doubt about where this story goes.
So we have just this graphic to illustrate it. So the total amount of fossil fuel reserves, if you guys can put that up, right? That's 27 trillion. And then the amount that we can safely burn is about 5.4 trillion, right?
Exactly right.
So that's that
and
little...
safely in quotes, yes.
Safely in quotes. So that little orange slice, that's what we got. That's the budget, right? That's the budget for here until whenever. As long as we can kind of
2050 anyway.
Keep this thing going we call civilization.
Yep.
And the blue part is the part that's got to be left in the ground.
Exactly right. And what that means, since the oil industry and the coal industry are intent on burning the blue part, what it means is and what the point we're trying to communicate with this do the math tour is that they're the equivalent now to the safety of the planet that the tobacco industry became to individual health. Okay, these are outlaw companies. They're not outlaw against the laws of the nation. They get to write those, but they are outlaw against the laws of physics.
I just want to jump in here real quickly and actually deliver some even worse news.
Awesome. Great.
Sorry to bum folks out, but PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the biggest, insurance firms in the world, 5 days before the election came out with a report, and the cover said, "Too late for 2 degrees."
Right.
Now, I don't mean to contradict Bill here. He's been doing this for longer than I have.
Right.
But with Pricewaterhouse, they crunched the numbers. Never since World War II have we gone above 1% in our total decarbonization in terms of how much carbon we're able to actually stop burning, take out of the atmosphere, et cetera. Never above 1. Pricewaterhouse calculated for the next 39 years we'd have to go above 5%. We're currently averaging 0.7 to 0.8% decarbonization a year. So, all due respect, 2 degrees, serious benchmark, global agreement, but is it even possible?
Unless we change very fast.
And now think
there.
about the gargantuan sums of money those same industries spent to attempt to elect Mitt Romney and defeat President Barack Obama. These were the people. If you think about the Koch brothers, we think of them as sort of this amorphous evil. They are not amorphous. They are this industry. They're
pikers compared to the biggest fossil fuel companies. The biggest fossil fuel companies. And I don't know if the biggest fossil fuel companies care that much who's in office, because I feel like they genuinely feel that they could basically work their magic on both sides.
We're going to have a really interesting early test case, and that's this Keystone Pipeline thing that went away for a while because the president said we're going to spend a year studying it. Well, in the course of that year, Mother Nature filed her public comments. We had the hottest year in American history. We had epic drought. We melted the Arctic. And then we had this, small storm that filled the New York City subway system with water. That aside, the oil industry is still pretty sure. The head of the American Petroleum Institute said last week we had implicit promises from the Obama administration that we would approve this pipeline. We're going back to D.C. on Sunday to thousands of us to remind the White House we haven't forgotten.
I want to talk about the pipeline, and I do think there's some good news on the horizon, and there is some kind of breakup in some of the political stalemate that we've seen right after this break. The Keystone Pipeline is a pipeline that would bring tar sands oil from Canada down into the U.S. And tar sands oil is particularly toxic, carbon-intensive stuff, right? It's not the easy, light, sweet crude.
Disgusting, I think, is the technical term.
It's disgusting stuff, but it's valuable, right? That's why they're pulling it out and bring it down, and it turned into a political football.
But they're bringing it to the Gulf Coast to export a lot of it.
Right, to export it. So it became this issue, and I think Republicans thought they had a real issue in it when I think some effective activism by 350.org and other climate activists managed to essentially put pause on it. The State Department had to give it its seal of approval and didn't before the election. And immediately, I think the next day, you already saw the American Petroleum Institute starting to move on this. And Congressman is someone who has to, get elected and work with other people who have to get elected, and some of whom have to get elected in swing districts. The Republicans, I think, thought they had the upper hand on the story around the Keystone Pipeline. And I wonder what you think the political terrain looks like for blocking it, or for talking about the fact that ripping every cell of carbon out of the earth is a problematic endeavor.
Well, I think a lot of this depends, frankly, on presidential leadership. He's got the bully pulpit, and we're not going to get very far if he doesn't use it. It really comes back to the administration. We just had an election in which the Keystone Pipeline wasn't that huge an issue.
No.
But
they thought it was going to be.
But because the president put it off and said we're going to do it or make a decision, et cetera, it sort of got taken out of the election. On the other hand, a lot of Democratic candidates got pretty badly bashed in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Appalachians by the administration's war on coal.
Right.
Now, what is the war on coal? It's saying, hey, we got to be careful about how much coal we're taking, how we use it, about the carbon footprint, et cetera. So you've got a part of the Democratic Party, not to mention the Republican Party, which does not want any limitations, and certainly not carbon tax or anything, because they get killed at home.
The war on coal, one should note, is basically being waged by something called natural gas prices, much more than it's being waged by the Obama administration. And in fact,
but that's the reality. But but it was used as a political weapon.
It was. But one of the things, and this, I guess I don't want to linger too much on doom and gloom. But we have reduced. There has been a sort of remarkable reduction in carbon emissions in the U.S. I mean, we're down to 1990 levels, right? Do we have it going down is going in the right direction, right?
There are two things happening. There are two things happening that might go in the right direction. One, which the administration deserves a lot of credit on, is energy conservation, higher CAFE standards, mileage,
fuel efficiency,
fuel efficiency, and the other, which hopefully, which actually is part of this whole budget discussion, although people aren't really focusing on it. Do we renew the tax credits for wind and other alternative energy sources? The Republicans don't want to renew that at all. They want to renew the tax credits for coal and oil, as if the coal and oil companies aren't profitable enough already. But so that's the first step, even before the Keystone, probably.
Absolutely, and I think a real untold story agreed that natural gas prices have helped drive coal's share down to, I think it's now 34% of generated electricity in America, which is huge. It used to be 50. Right. But a huge portion of that is actually renewables. September, 100% of the new electricity generated in America was renewable. 100%.
Right. But I mean, I think you also have the tension the other way, and I think Congressman Nadler got to it, is that you do have a lot of people sort of day-to-day livelihood in places like West Virginia and Louisiana, so that while their environment is being destroyed, right? I mean, if you think about Louisiana as a state that is being literally destroyed by the industry that employs a good number of the people there, so every mechanism in that state is designed to protect an industry that's destroying the state from an environmental standpoint, but people's real lives are tied to it. So even Democrats in West Virginia, somebody like Jay Rockefeller, who's considered a great progressive, when it comes to coal, he's with the Republicans.
Anyone who's going to be elected, I mean, there's certain places where it's the geographic interests override the ideological ones.
That's why it's, as the congressman said, we need some actual leadership from the president and others on the really central issues. I mean, look,
but the leadership,
climate change is the legacy issue of all legacy issues. It's 100 years from now, the only thing that people are going to look back on 2012 and care about. Now, the fiscal cliff or the whatever. It's like, you guys, the Arctic melted and you didn't do anything about it? Why is that?
I've got to say, though, Bill, I mean, Keystone is one pipeline. Enbridge, the Canadian company that spilled all that oil in Michigan in 2010, is planning to double that same pipeline that leaked. So let's say even Obama rejects Keystone. A lot of that oil is still going to come down through a pipeline that's double the size in Michigan. They're looking at a pipeline now to the east because of what happened in the west. Bill was right. Victory in the Western Canada, but now they're trying to ship it east.
Right.
So,
but I also want to talk about my question here is, the presidential leadership aside, and I think the bully pulpit could be a little overrated. Like, you still got the House Republican caucus at the end of the day, and the question is, like, I want to hear from you the theory of change here that is like attacking this problem that isn't just more speeches from Barack Obama. Right if we take this break.
I'm sorry.
There's no doubt that for us to take on climate change in a serious way would involve making some tough political choices. And, understandably, I think the American people right now have been so focused and will continue to be focused on our economy and jobs and growth that, if the message is somehow we're going to ignore jobs and growth simply to address climate change, I don't think anybody's going to go for that. I won't go for that.
President answering the question on climate change in the press conference on Wednesday. So, Bill, I mean, presidential leadership, sure, important, I guess, but given the obstacles that you have laid out so convincingly, it seems to me like there's something much bigger that has to happen.
Y'all are deeply focused on Washington all the time, but maybe it's time to move our gaze a little bit. The reason we set out on this Do the Math tour at 350.org was to say, after 20 years of sending the world's greatest scientists up to the Hill and nothing happening, maybe it's time to rethink the game plan a little bit. The problem here in the end is the fossil fuel industry, okay? Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money, okay? These guys have more money than God. And that means that we're going to need to put a little hurt on them if we're going to have any chance of changing politics in Washington or in Beijing or in a lot of other places. We set out on this tour, which has been drawing huge crowds across the country, to spark a campaign that looks in part like the one that helped bring down apartheid South Africa. We're getting colleges to huge pressure on them to divest. In fact, the first college in America, last week we were in Portland, Maine, in a huge packed-out theater, and the president of little Unity College stood up and said, our board of trustees just voted to sell all our stock in the fossil fuel industry. We're going to turn these guys into the tobacco industry if we possibly can. And if we do, maybe it'll open up a little more room for people like Barack Obama to be a little more courageous than they've been.
I think another piece of good news, too, is you're seeing the media kind of get rid of a little bit of that false balance where they were giving climate skeptics equal airtime to believers. I don't think that's happening as much as it used to.
Yeah, no, I think that has changed a lot. I think the problem is that it's been replaced by a lot of just lack of coverage. I mean, because it's like when there's a controversy, you can cover controversy, and when there was a bill on climate on Capitol Hill, you can cover the bill on Capitol Hill. Wax and Markey. Is Wax and Markey going to pass?
Here's the good bad news. Mother Nature is going to continue to give us ample opportunity to talk about this issue because this is going to be the hottest year in American history. It's fought trails only last year as the year with the most expensive disasters in American history. We're getting hit hard all the time. When the cover of that radical rag Business Week says it's global warming stupid, things are starting to shift.
Well, I think you also have to kind of break the right's stranglehold on the base of the Republican Party. I mean, we were talking a little bit in the break about how it's become almost an evangelical meme that you mustn't believe in climate change. And they've evangelized this because you've married the religious right to the corporate right in a way that is unseemly if you're a religious person, but that really has gotten the base of the Republican Party, which in turn informs their politicians. They are not permitted in a lot of ways to believe or accept the idea of climate change as a matter of faith. So I think now that you've kind of broken, I've been calling it a terrarium glass, right? The right has finally seen that, wait a minute, maybe our media isn't being honest with us, right, about polls and things like that. This might be an opportunity to start to get at the base of the Republican Party because there is an almost religious skepticism. As a matter of faith, they don't believe in climate change.
But I think several things are the case here. Number one, Bill is entirely right. Mother Nature is going to head us over the head repeatedly. We're going to see more and more tremendous storms, more and more huge wildfires, droughts, and so forth. And the information is going to get out there that this is related to global warming, number one. Number two, you have this tremendous interest in the status quo. These huge companies that have tremendous resources and money and control politics through money. Regions of the country, working people depend on coal and oil and so forth. You probably have to do two things simultaneously. One is do what you can, to divestment, to demonize, to point out the bad things. But the other thing is bribery. You probably,
says the congressman.
Yeah, well, you probably have to show both people in West Virginia and in Appalachia and Louisiana and companies how you can continue to be employed on changing things. How we should have programs. We used to talk about military conversion. We should have programs to say, take Mr. Oil Company, take your resources, get into wind, get into geothermal, get into something else, and employ these people in West Virginia.
The really good news the last couple of weeks has been coming not out of the United States, it's been coming out of Europe. The German energy minister in the conservative government of Angela Merkel said last week, we're going to scream past our targets of renewable energy. We're going to be at 50% renewable energy by 2020 or 2022 or something. We may be at 66%. There were days this summer when Germany generated more than half the power it used from solar panels within its borders. And this is Germany. I mean, it's Munich's north of Montreal. It's foggy. They don't have Texas, California, Nevada,
but the biggest
Arizona.
Immediate battle, which is not getting the attention it should, in fact, it's getting very little attention, is as part of this whole fiscal mess that's coming up, is the existing tax credits for renewables expire. And you see Republican senators saying, above all else, don't renew them.
Yeah.
And
I think that position, though, Congressman, it's going to have to break. You see more and more Republican governors, for instance, in the middle of the country from red states.
What I'm saying is we have to insist on that. That's the most immediate thing.
One big question, I think, is when you get on a path, if there's going to be a sort of virtuous cycle that can be kicked in with renewables in which things start to beat their expectations. And I want to sort of hear a little bit about what that future might look like right after this break. Here's an International Energy Agency report about emissions. And this is the conversation you hear. There's this kind of stages of denial, this kind of like stages of climate denial. And it's like, well, no, the Earth isn't warming. Well, it's warming. Well, it's not humans. Well, it is humans. Well, we can't do anything about it. Well, we can't do anything. Well, if we do something about it, then China and India aren't going to do something about it, and it's all wash. Those are basically the stages. And so, this is the IEA report. Global energy demand grows by more than 1/3 over the period to 2035 in our scenario. China, India, and the Middle East accounting for 60% of that increase. So people will say, look, even if we get our house in order, and I hear this all the time from people who are not in the denialist camp, who are just like, what are you going to do? And you, Joy, had a question during the break about...
absolutely, because you were talking about what's happening in Germany, we're talking about in Europe, we're saying there's some advancements here in North America and as well as in Europe. But what about China? I mean, if China is the big, elephant in the room in terms of emissions, what are they doing?
So I did a big piece last year for the National Geographic on China and energy, and it's incredibly interesting and complicated. The Chinese are starting to, they're emulating us and burning a lot of coal. They'll never catch up with us in per capita emissions, but they're putting a lot of carbon out in the atmosphere. At the same time, they're leading the world in the installation of renewable technology. 250 million Chinese, when they take a shower at night, the hot water comes off the roof. That's 25% of that population. In this country, solar hot water accounts for less than 1% of our homes, and most of that's for swimming pools. And here's the thing. If you go to the guy who runs the biggest of these solar hot water companies, a guy named Huang Ming, Hemin Solar, in his private museum, the pride of place goes to an old rusting solar panel. Says, do you know what that is? No. That's my best possession. That was one of the solar panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979 and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985 because he wanted, manlier forms of energy. It's not that we lack...
the Chinese solar baron bought that and put it in his private museum in China? I love that story.
We have the technology, we have the entrepreneurs, we just don't have the political will to do anything with it because we've got the Koch brothers and Exxon and everybody else in the way, which is why we're going hard after them.
What we also have, I think, is a reflexive ideological resistance to government playing a big role in this. I mean, I hear the China-India line from Republicans all the time. I actually talked to Mitt Romney's policy director a few weeks before the election, and I asked him, what do you think government can do at least to make coal cleaner? Carbon capture and sequestration, which currently doesn't really exist on a usable scale. He said, I don't think government should play a role in it at all.
Right.
So there you go. I mean, there's the barrier.
And yet government should play no role except to provide massive subsidies decade after decade
to legacy
fossil fuel industry.
Well, but this is where the tax extenders.
So why not provide a subsidy for cleaner coal?
Right. Well, this is where the tax extenders issue, which I think it brings us nicely full circle, because we started out talking about the fiscal curve. The tax extender issue has gotten very much lost, right? When you stack up the issues, it's down at the bottom, and in fact, whether you pass all the tax extenders or not defines the baseline that you then calculate your savings on. So it actually matters a tremendous amount. In those tax extenders, right, are these renewable energy tax credits. Now, the problem with renewable energy tax credits is that they're constantly sunsetting. And so I know people that work in solar, and I've been reporting on this, and you go out and you say, I want to raise capital investment on a program that's going to have this rate return on investment if and only if the tax cuts get extended, and they sunset every 7 days or whatever the heck they are. I mean, it's like every year, right? So when you can't build in any kind of long-term projection, you can't count on it, that this hurts investment, right?
Sure, absolutely. And we ought to, when we extend it, we ought to extend it for a good long period of time. What is I don't know the answer to the question, but what is the length of the various subsidies for coal and oil, which we got to get rid of, but they're not annual.
Well, they're part of the tax code, I think. Right? They're not specific provisions that are part of extenders. They're basically the depletion allowance, for instance. The depletion allowance is just part of the IRS code.
And when you try to have this conversation with Republicans, they yell Solyndra, and then they walk away.
That's the thing, Joy, and I want to put in a plug on this because you rarely hear a bipartisan bill in energy. Congressman Nadler's colleague Mike Thompson, a Democrat, and Ted Poe, a Republican from Texas, are sponsoring a bill right now that would allow renewables companies to have access to what's called a master limited partnership. Now, this is the way you structure a company that oil, gas, pipelines have had for years, but renewables don't get to have it. And it is a perpetual way that can be built into the law to allow them to raise easier capital. Ted Poe, Republican from Texas. But you don't hear about these kind of smaller bills.
That's fascinating. Bill McKibben, people can find out about where 350.org Do the Math Tour is going to be at the website.
At 350.org or math.350.org. And I'll just say this. Yeah. It's been really exciting. It's sort of a new moment. Look, the environmental movement went dormant for a while, but starting with Keystone, and now people are really waking up. They're understanding that this is the question of a lifetime.
So what do we know that we didn't know last week? My answer's after this. So what do we know now that we didn't know last week? We now know that Democrats cannot count on New York's supposedly Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo as an ally, and every Democratic primary voter in the entire country should know that too. We already knew that in the run-up to the election, Andrew Cuomo, whose aspirations for national office are well known, did essentially nothing to aid the Democratic Party in its quest to take back the state Senate from Republicans. We know that while his putative reason for not endorsing Democrats in contested races with Republican incumbents was that he did not want to wound those Republicans who'd voted for the successful marriage equality legislation, that explanation does not address, for example, his refusal to endorse the Democratic candidate in one race where the incumbent Republican had been defeated in the primary by a Tea Party challenger. We know we never got an explanation from Cuomo for his lack of endorsement in that race. And we now know that even without Cuomo's help, Democrats managed to win an apparent majority in the state Senate, with 2 seats still being recounted. But just as it looked like Democrats would win back the Senate majority, Brooklyn Democrat Simcha Felder, elected as a Democrat with the D next to his name, announced just a few days after he ran and won as a Democrat that he would caucus with the Republicans, putting the Republicans then just 1 seat away from a majority, pending the outcome of those 2 unresolved races. Despite the fact that he's the leader of the Democratic Party in the state and wishes someday to be the Democratic nominee for president, Cuomo has refused to intervene with Felder, saying he won't insert himself into the controversy. And watching all this unfold, one can't help suspect that Andrew Cuomo actually does not want a Democratic majority in the state Senate, because a Republican majority gives him more of an opportunity to burnish his bipartisan compromiser bona fides before launching his presidential campaign. And much, much, much more insidiously, we suspect he doesn't want a Democratic majority because said majority stands ready to pass a whole raft of incredibly important, groundbreaking progressive legislation, including public financing for elections, marijuana decriminalization, and a minimum wage hike, among others. The governor says he favors all those policies, but in this case, he sure is not acting like it. We're almost entirely sure that very soon Andrew Cuomo will be coming before many of the people watching this show, asking for your support in a Democratic primary race to be the next president. And you should remember this remarkably cynical display when he does. Governor Cuomo's office did not respond to our requests for comment on some of the specifics we just discussed, but we invite the governor to come on the program anytime. I want to find out what my guests now know that they didn't know when the week began. Mr. Bill McKibben.
Well, the thing that's become very clear since the election is that we're really going to find out now when it comes to energy and climate what the president is all about. He no longer has to worry about, and ever again, about the fossil fuel industry coming down on him in an election. We're going to have really stark, pure tests like Keystone where he'll get to find out whether or not he's thinking about the future or not.
Alana Shore.
The Army Corps of Engineers, we knock them a lot for being anti-environment and for good reason.
Yes, for very good reason.
But what blew my mind, after Hurricane Sandy, the Army Corps sent some hydrologic specialists to New York. They removed enough water from our subway system and our ports to fill Central Park 2 feet above the ground.
The recovery, the New York Times did this amazing piece. It was one of these pieces sometimes you read as a journalist, sometimes you wish, was like, I wish I had that assignment. I wish I could have written that piece. They did a piece about how the tunnels in New York got drained and how the MTA the subway system got back working in a miraculous fashion. You had even the Strap Hangers campaign, which is this advocacy group that beat up on the MTA all the time. And again, for good reason, trying to get better service for folks, saying this is close to magic, what has happened. And it's a good reminder in the climate discussion, we are capable of amazing things. We are capable of amazing things. And the New York City subway system is a miracle of civilization. Absolutely. And a good reminder that we can do big things.
Don't forget for a minute that there's still people out in the Rockaways and on the Jersey Shore. And one of the great things that happened this week is that the Occupy movement turned into a kind of relief movement, and Occupy Sandy has been doing remarkable stuff.
Congressman Nadler.
Well, we were reminded of one thing that we knew, which is the utter hypocrisy of the UN and the non-aligned movement when it comes to Israel and the Middle East, that said nothing when Hamas was fired over 500 or 600 missiles at Israeli civilians, each missile being a war crime. And when Israel finally hit back by attacking a leader of the militants and started attacking launch sites, suddenly there's a UN Security Council meeting and the non-aligned movement condemns Israel. And we also learned that despite the ravings of Governor Romney about Obama throwing Israel under the bus and the ravings of the Republican Jewish Coalition and some other elements of the Jewish community, when push comes to shove, the Obama administration stood by Israel.
We're going to discuss Gaza tomorrow, and I just want to respond quickly, which is there has been asymmetry in moral intent, which is the stated aim of many of the militants has been to go after civilians, and the stated aim of the IDF has to avoid civilians. But in the actual death toll, we are seeing more civilian lives in Gaza. This is just an empirical fact, dead than Israelis. And I want to just make sure people are aware of that. We're going to talk about this much more tomorrow.
Okay,
Joy.
Well, we now know that the Beltway sort of meme that there was a lack of African-American enthusiasm to re-elect the president was, in fact, a myth. African-Americans voted in the same or larger numbers than in 2008 in almost every one of the key swing states. We also now know, as of this week, that more of the destructive, dangerous technology tied to the extractive industries, power plants, et cetera, are actually built in African-American communities. The African-American community is very energized to continue its activism into this second term. I think the African-American community, especially evangelical black churches, should be brought into the movement on climate change.
My thanks to Bill McKibben of 350.org, Alana Shore from the Greenwire website, New York Congressman Jerry Nadler at MSNBC, contributor Joy Reid.